I love coming down to Circular Quay. It's one of my favourite places. I was born in Sydney and it's always a joy to come back to Circular Quay and look at the water and the sun dancing on the sea and look at the old ships that still come in and go all the way across to Manly. But it wasn't always called Circular Quay. When Arthur Phillip first arrived, he called it Sydney Cove. And there was a lovely sandy beach just here, and over to the west there was this lovely freshwater stream coming down. And he arrived on January the 22nd, 1788, and he'd come around from Botany Bay. And when he arrived at Botany Bay on January the 18th, 1788, it says in his diary, he was out of the boat and on the shore, and it seemed like in minutes he'd made friends with the Aborigines. And there they all were, according to his diary, walking along the beach, figuring out where he was going to park his big canoe. And they were saying, well, it's a bit too shallow over here, Philip, you know, you'll never get your ship in. And over there's the mango trees, and of course the council's never going to let you park your boat near the mango trees. And I really think, as I read his diary, that it was the Aborigines that somehow said, you need to go north into Port Jackson. Because when the rest of the fleet was coming in on the 22nd, he was waving them goodbye because he'd taken 3 pinnaces, which is the boats where you get the 6 or the 8 fellas rowing, and he came around here to Port Jackson. Well, he came up the harbour and he pulled into this lovely sandy beach. And the pinnace came up into the sand and he got out of the boat, and it happened to him again. The locals came out of the trees and they came down to meet him, and all of a sudden he was getting on exceptionally well. It was sometimes later that Arthur Phillip was thinking about, why am I getting on so well with the natives? And it turned out he was missing his front tooth. And when he said, "G'day fellas, you know, it's nice to be here," and he smiled and showed him that the fact he was missing his front tooth, then all the natives took a step backwards and smiled back at him, because they were all missing their front tooth as well, because it was the sign of the passage from boyhood to manhood. So there he was, getting on exceptionally well with the Aborigines, the locals here in Sydney Cove. So he spent the first day with them and then had dinner with them, and the chief sat around looking at how they boiled meat in a pot, which was a whole new idea to him. And the next day, on January 23rd, Phillip took one of the boats and he went across the other side of the harbour. And as he pulled into another lovely sandy cove, these men decided that they were going to wade out to the boat and have a look at him. And he thought this was really impressive, really sort of showing some courage and quite a manly thing to do. So he called the place Manly Cove. Anyway, he said, well, that's been very nice visiting you. I'm going to go back to where I was. So 30 of the men got in canoes and followed him back here across to Sydney Cove. And they then spent the night also on the beach and having dinner with him, you know, and getting to know the new fellow from England. The next day, the 24th, he said, now, fellas, I've got to go away and get my big canoes, and I'll be back again tomorrow. So I'll see you when I get back. So back he went to Botany Bay, and of course the fleet was just coming in, and he said, well, this place is not going to work out for us, but I've got the most ideal spot. It's this phenomenal harbour, and it will take 1,000 ships of the line. It's so big and beautiful. So with that, he then packed up and said, now I'm going back, pack up all your goods and the rest of it, and follow me around. So he came back into this harbour on the 25th of January, hoisted a flag or put it on a tree, and he got out the cheap wine they'd got in South Africa, and as they watched the sun setting over the gum trees, he said, we toasted the King's health. It was the next day, January 26th, that the other boats arrived, having seen the flag. So what happened on January 26th? Well, nothing really, except the male convicts and the Marines came ashore, and for the next 10 days they worked to clear the land and make it possible for all the tents to go up before everybody else arrived. The big event was February the 7th, or some would say it was actually probably February the 6th. Because after everything was cleared and the tents were up, it was time for all the women to get off the boat and come ashore. So everybody fixed themselves up and tidied themselves up, the women and the men. And so Phillip said, well, we've done this long trip, you can have a party. So I'll give you some rum and some wine, and I'll go and hide on one of the ships and pretend I don't know what's going on. So here was this phenomenal party. They lit this fire and the bands were playing, and of course I could just imagine some local people leaning against a tree saying, now that's a corroboree. And so this party went on into the night, and so it was only the fact that a big southerly storm came along, brought down the trees, and the rain was just horrendous that forced them all back into the tent. But on the 7th, which was the next day, everybody had to be in uniform. All the Marines were there. They set up a stage and brought in some chairs. All the convicts were sitting on the ground, which was, of course, the wet grass at this stage, just over here on the west. And so a parade, the soldiers marched past, and the young Attorney General, David Collins, read the letters patent from the King. Now, this letters patent, that seems to be something we don't know about, is one of the most phenomenal documents ever written in British history. And it's phenomenal for a number of reasons. And this document is the foundation for the social, political, and even the religious life of this new country, and we're not teaching it in schools. This document, this letters patent, and probably the first one of its kind that was ever done by the British, has 4 incredible aspects to it. The first one is that the King, in writing this letter to Philip, bans slavery. There will be no slavery in this new colony. So there was no capturing the Aborigines and putting them in chains, or forcing the Aborigines or the convicts into slavery and servitude. You couldn't go buying and selling convicts, and you couldn't go buying and selling the local people as well. Slavery was banned. The other interesting thing in this document is that Philip was to give the convicts land, and if they brought their wives with them, more land, or children, they got more land. Well, this was significant because in England, you didn't basically own land. You worked on somebody else's land and paid the church or some landlord a lot of money just to survive and have a home on their land. But in this place, in Australia, in New South Wales, the governor was going to give you land if you wanted to make a go of your life. The next thing was that the King actually decided that these people that were living here, he couldn't do a treaty with them. There wasn't a king. He couldn't do a lease with them. They didn't have any sense of value for money. And so he just decided he was going to step over the top of all of that. There'd be no agreements. He was just going to assume that all these people were now his people, and he was going to call them British subjects. And therefore they had equal rights as British subjects as everybody else in the colony and everybody else in the empire. And so this was a marvellous step when the Aborigines actually received the same rights. And later on I found instances where Aborigines were actually suing Caucasians where they had been mistreated. The last and interesting thing I noticed in this letters patent was the fact that the people that came out here, while they had been convicted in court, they had been sentenced to transportation. And this meant that they were being given a second chance at life because they had committed some sort of misdemeanor crime. And so what actually happens with that is that they're designated as in the service of the governor. And so in service of the governor meant that it was actually Governor Phillip who was looking after them and making sure that nobody was mistreating them, that they only worked 5.5 or 6 days a week, they were properly fed and they were properly clothed. Because as I was saying, these people were not sent out here to be incarcerated or mistreated. They were being sent out here to be given a second chance at life. So after this great ceremony on the 7th of February the 7th, Philip said, well, we're going to have a dinner and we'll give everybody extra rations and we'll continue the party. The party continued not very far from here as they built up a place just west of here called the Rocks. So let's go and have a look at the Rocks.